So today we're going to be making a really hearty mushroom-based dish. For those of you who aren't necessarily a fan of mushrooms, have only tried them once or twice, there are a plethora of gorgeous mushrooms out there to try. Today we'll be using 3 different varieties. And I do suggest you giving them a try again, maybe in a different context than you're used to. Like if you've just had sort of some plain mushrooms as a side dish, maybe you don't love the texture or love the taste. But they're very, very high in nutrients. They're actually great immune boosters. So today we will be working with actually some button mushrooms, which look like this, some portobello mushrooms, which look like this, and then my very favorite shiitake mushrooms, which look like this. I know when I first started into nutrient density and so on and so forth, I had trouble identifying which ones I was buying in the store, so hopefully that gives you a nice quick tutorial. Right now we're gonna pair up this hearty mushroom dish with some quinoa. Now quinoa is a source of all 9 essential amino acids. It's got a lot of antioxidants and a lot of other great things in them. It's really truly a superfood. So people ask me about what kind of quinoa to buy. Because it's got a little bit better nutrient availability to your body, I always buy the sprouted kind. And typically, if you're looking for a red or black quinoa, that's got a little higher antioxidant content than the white quinoa. So I would say if you're really being particular, those would be the best kinds to get. So what we're going to start out doing, the quinoa is already on. Super easy to cook. Just follow package instructions and watch your quinoa because it does cook much, much quicker than a rice, say, which takes significantly longer. So what we're going to do, starting in this pan, is we've already got some coconut oil all lined up and ready to go, probably about a tablespoon of coconut oil. Then we have here about half a red onion cut up and 1 clove of garlic. And it's always best to put those in first because they really kind of flavor everything really nicely. The pan gets a great flavor. Plus, you know, when you're cooking, then the whole house starts to smell just like wonderful when that happens. And people do ask me, you know, so how long do I let these onions cook for? How long do I let the garlic cook for? A good rule to follow is once it starts to become kind of a little translucent or a little browned, that's usually about the right time to start adding in other ingredients. And that's when we've kind of got some really, really nice flavors going on in there. So I'm going to start to let that brown a little bit. I'm going to show you what quinoa looks like as it's cooking in the pan. This has already been cooking for a little while, but this probably only has about 5 minutes left. And then really easy to put some stuff on top of. Quinoa is actually not technically a grain, it's a pseudo grain, meaning that it's actually a seed. And it's really, really a wonderful thing to add to your diet. You can cook it, or if you're into sprouting, which if you're new to this you may or may not be, it actually is probably the easiest thing ever to sprout. So that's something you can Google as sprouting quinoa. It takes no time at all. Whereas, for example, we were just sprouting chickpeas, and that kind of takes forever. It takes a really long time to sprout some chickpeas. So while that's happening, I'm going to go to making a nice little creamy base that we can throw the mushrooms in. So this is something that's, I know it looks like a science experiment. It does a little bit look like a science experiment. But what it is, it's actually just the cashews soaked overnight. I used 2/3 cup of cashews in this particular instance, but you could use more or less depending on how creamy you want things. And soaking makes it a little bit easier for you to digest it, but in this case it also is going to make it so that when we put it in the food processor, it's going to blend up really easily and really nicely into just like a gorgeous cream. So straining that, ta-da, throwing it into the food processor. And we actually have 2 food processors, nothing like very high level like a Vitamix or anything like that, but I think that's an essential part of every kitchen, honestly. Vitamix is sort of the go-to brand, but even without that, we do so much great work with cooking this. So quinoa is actually done, which is very, very nice. We're gonna throw in with the cashews about 1 tablespoon of mustard. Now you can use a little more or less depending on how much you like mustard. I'm also going to throw in a little bit of nutritional yeast. So now if you're not familiar with nutritional yeast, it kind of adds a nice cheesy flavor to everything, and it is full of lots of different nutrients, B vitamins, actually very high in protein too. This is the brand that we use, Red Star. There are a few other brands out there, but this tends to be our favorite. So I would say we're going to go for like a tablespoon of nutritional yeast here, but you can add a little bit more if you want a really cheesy flavor. Let's say a heaping tablespoon. And now, beautiful. So the onions are nice and brown, and the kitchen is smelling awesome right now. So here's how you know we're ready to add in some other stuff. That looks beautiful. I'm going to take the heat down a notch, just a little bit, because as you can tell, we work on these this beautiful gas stove, so things get hot really fast in here. And so now what I'm doing is I'm adding all the mushrooms that I pre-cut, because it's boring to sit here and watch me cut up mushrooms, right? Nobody wants to watch that. But what we did is a cup of shiitake mushrooms, a cup of the portobello mushrooms, and then a cup of these white button mushrooms. And that's how we came to this lovely mixture right here. And I'm just going to kind of mix them up. And mushrooms shrink down a lot when you cook them. So if you put it in your pan and you're like, wow, this seems just kind of like an overwhelming amount of mushroom, don't worry, it's going to come down quite a bit actually once you cook it. Now, as this is starting to cook, I have made a little bit of vegetable broth in here, just a cup's worth. And I am going to throw that into the mix. And that's going to give it a little bit of salt, a little bit of seasoning, and bring out kind of like this meaty flavor and texture. But to thicken it, now some people, of course, would use like a wheat flour or something like that, but when we're talking about nutrient density here, so we're going to go for a coconut flour, and I'm going to add about, again, a tablespoon of that, but you can add more or less depending on how thick you want it. When I say tablespoon, I always go for a heaping tablespoon. No wimpy, girly kind of tablespoons happening over here. So that's going to cook up, and we are going to get back to this lovely little paste we're making, where this is going to come out really super thick and creamy. And I've made this before, and I can tell you that like this is one of those really hearty, sort of satisfying winter meals that you're just like, oh, I could eat this whole thing on a cold day. It comes out beautiful. Even people who don't really love mushrooms, as I said, tend to find this really appealing. So we have our nutritional yeast, our mustard, our cashews, and we're going to throw it in there, and we are going to blend it all up. Now, what you might find a little bit as you're blending it up here, you you might need to add a little bit of water. I think I will do in this particular case is just add a little tiny bit of water to get it into a nice consistency there. Always good to use filtered water if you can. So we're just going to throw a tiny bit of that in there. And depending on how creamy you want the consistency, you can add more water or less water. Now, if you remember from our first recipe, parsley, also a great ingredient in terms of nutrient density, and it adds a nice little flavor. You don't want to think about parsley as a side dish anymore, or just as a garnish, I should say. Throwing it into things really amps up the nutrient content. So we are going to add that. Then we have about a quarter cup to a third of a cup of parsley. And we're going to crank this back on after adding a little bit of water to it. So now, this is how you can tell if you need to add more or less water. So right now, this is kind of still, well, maybe like a little tiny bit, like chunky. So I can add a little water or a little bit of almond milk to make that really creamy consistency that you're going to want for this in particular. The other thing we are going to just add in a second is we have this mushroom gravy. That's also going to kind of thicken things up a little bit. So just about 1 packet is perfect. You can also use 1 can. This is about the right amount to go in here. And the mushrooms are already cooking down quite a bit. So we're going to get a really, really nice sized dish here. So 1 packet of mushroom gravy. It's going to make it like really just thick and hearty. It's gorgeous. Plus, once we add the cashew cream, it's really, oh, it's just going to be off the charts. So now we're kind of looking at a little bit more of a stew. And I am going to add that parsley in, which has already been chopped up. You can absolutely use a food processor for this if you prefer, because I don't like cutting things really, very time consuming, but to cut up the mushrooms, I think here, that gives it a nice look and a nice texture. To cut up the parsley, you know, if you have time, or otherwise the food processor is a good way to go. So I think I'm going to add just a tiny bit of almond milk to that cashew cream. That'll make it even a little bit better. When you add an almond milk, if you're doing a savory dish, always add plain unsweetened, and don't add the vanilla, because that might give it a little, well, I mean, it might give it a unique texture or a unique taste profile, but flavor profile, I should say. But unless you're into experimenting like that, you might want to just stick with savory. So in terms of, see, now we have it perfect. Perfect! Look at that. So it actually does look exactly like a cream right now, which is how it's going to be used in this particular recipe. So if you're wondering now, okay, so I'm an athlete and I'm looking into all of this for recovery, so at what point in my athletic endeavors is a meal like this going to be really good? And this is a perfect recovery kind of meal because we have the complete protein with the quinoa. We have all the immune boosting profile of the mushrooms. We have all these nutrients in the parsley. Cashews, as you remember from last time, they're just so good in so many ways. And this is really good to fight any inflammation that you have. You could also, if you wanted to be adventurous, you can try some herbs that would help to take down inflammation. For example, cumin, turmeric, ginger, all of those are really good in terms of fighting inflammation. But you have to try out those herbs a little bit, put a little on your finger, see if you like it. Some people don't really love the taste of cumin. Ginger, I personally have it in a tea pretty much every night because I feel like that's a really good way to go with it. So now, I will hold this up in a second. But this has turned into like this nice kind of creamy, awesome looking stew. But let's say, Julie, I want it really thick. I want it super creamy, like where my spoon's gonna get stuck. Really simple, like you could add more cashews if you want to do it that way. Or you can add a little bit more coconut flour, or buckwheat flour is another really good way to go. You can also throw in a little bit more nutritional yeast if you want a little bit more of that cheesy texture to it, or cheesy flavor, I should say. As far as texture, that's your personal preference. So let's see how we're doing here. Yeah, that is an absolutely like just gorgeous, gorgeous dish, and super easy, done. So I will show you what this looks like. Here is our finished mushroom base. I'm very spazzy, so I have to do this very carefully. Ta-da! It is gorgeous. Again, thicken, however, if you want, with cashews or with more coconut flour or buckwheat. Our finished quinoa. Beautiful. Right there. Let's see if I can get a spoon to, yeah, here we go. So here's your finished quinoa. And then really, really, really easy in terms of serving. We just get some quinoa. And then our beautiful mushroom stew in whatever amount you would like. And if you want, you could even use more parsley for garnish. Bon appetit!